The next bill we're going to hear is 5078 by myself. This act would require that prior to suspension being issued to a student in grades kindergarten through 5, inclusive of the 5th grade, the school would implement an individual behavior plan. And in developing the plan, there would be an emphasis given to empathy for the students, culturally responsive to the student, and considering any special needs or differently able students, how they may be impacted by the plan. And ladies and gentlemen, this just came from the fact that I looked at the data for suspensions in kindergarten through the 5th grade. We're telling little kids in kindergarten, suspending them from school, 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade. I think we can do better. And, you know, my experience as an administrator at elementary school was brief in Pawtucket, but compared to the secondary level of when we suspended students, there were situations that were very unreasonable and understandable. Elementary school, suspending a student, I think that we have to take or find a methodology, whether it's working with a behavioral plan, a preliminary plan to address the issue with the student. I just think that excluding young children from school is wrong. So, with that, we have several witnesses on both sides of this issue. Are there any questions for me, from anyone? And now Representative Fen Fung, do you have a question? No? And Representative Donovan probably has spent a lot more time in elementary school than I have, but I think we should try to find a different method. With that, Randall Rose. Mr. Parisi. Jim Parisi, Rhode Island AAF Federation of Teachers and Healthcare Professionals. Welcome, Mr. Parisi.
Chairman, thank you again for giving me an opportunity to speak. And I want to offer some respectful opposition to the chair's bill that would create some restrictions on elementary school administrators prior to suspending a student. And while we fully support efforts to limit student suspensions at all grades, we can't support the creation of a bureaucratic impediment to any elementary student suspension. And I have to note that my members, teachers and school support staff who I represent, aren't the ones who have authority to suspend students, but they are impacted by restrictions on student discipline that could negatively impact the school learning environment. Sometimes it's necessary for a student to be removed from a classroom to enable the rest of the students to learn, and such a cooling off period would effectively be eliminated by the bill. Creating a requirement that behavior plans be created prior to suspension may be too much of an unnecessary burden on schools, and depending on how the requirement is implemented, requiring those behavior plans could be a real burden on school staff such as guidance counselors, school psychologists, and school social workers. So I think there are a lot of aspects in the bill that ought to be considered by any school district that is revising its student discipline policies, and all of our districts have student discipline policies, but we can't support imposing all provisions on this bill on all districts in all circumstances in which a suspension of an elementary student is being considered. So we respectfully cannot support the legislation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Representative Caldwell.
Thank you, Chairman. Hi, Jim. It's so nice to hear your voice. I wish I could see you.
Likewise.
You know, I have to push back a little bit on this idea that this would be too burdensome on the administration and the guidance counselors. You know, as a parent of 2 elementary age children who are in elementary school now, kindergarten and 3rd grade, you know, I actually think that that actually provides a good time for the folks at the school to consider what might be happening with the student. It provides everyone an extra step to see if the student needs more services or more help or what is happening there. You know, when elementary school kids act out in such a way that they would need to be removed from school, I would call a suspension more than a cooling off period. It means that if you have a family with 2 working parents, one of them has to stay home. It also means that that student is missing out on valuable instructional time. And, you know, with little kids, especially after all the months that they've been doing distance learning, is just incredibly valuable to them right now. And I would hope that in the elementary schools, this wasn't happening so much that that extra step would cause a huge time burden, or else that would be another issue we'd have to address. So I just think that extra step that the chairman is recommending is a really valuable time to be able to check in with that student and the administrators and the teachers who work with that student to see if, you know, other steps should be taken regarding their behavior, or if really suspension is the only way to do it. So thank you so much. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot as the session continues.
Sure, Representative, I certainly appreciate your perspective, and I don't disagree that, you know, in many instances, you know, students who are acting out ought to be working with the school support staff, such as the psychologists and social workers and guidance. The problem with this bill is that it requires that step prior to any suspension being issued. So it's really a suspension prohibition, and while, you know, none of us really like the idea of suspending any kindergartner or second grader, I've got to say, if there's an incident where a student is, you know, throwing chairs and being completely disruptive, and my child was affected by that, and they were scared in the classroom, I'd want the school to be able to do something. So I know in the secondary schools, there's more of an opportunity to have, you know, special classrooms where you can send students to, and unfortunately, a lot of those alternative ed kind of programs aren't available in the smaller elementary schools. So some of our concern is just the lack of resources that elementary schools have to, you know, find alternative placements for students who are chronically disruptive. And again, I'm not looking to, you know, see widespread suspension of any elementary student. I just wouldn't want a blanket prohibition imposed by the Assembly.
So, Mr. Chairman, can I just ask a follow-up question,
Yes,
please?
Representative Baez, then Representative Giraldo. Yes.
So for those students that are in elementary, right, and in regards of like a prior to suspension, because most of those teachers already that have those kids in a classroom, don't they have like a already individualized plan already for those students?
They may not.
So I think that, yeah, so definitely I think, because I think most teachers already have like most especially when it comes to lines of elementary. So most of these teachers already have like an individualized plan for those students. So just in addition to that, just to tag on this behavior plan, I don't think there'll be like any fight or reach on that, because I just suspending kids for like, you know, kindergarten, you know, through 5th grade. I just think it's not, at this time, and the time we in right now, the day and age, suspending like kids are in 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade without actually looking at the root cause of the problem. So I think we should probably, like, you know, push for the, and I support the chairman bill to push for the individualized behavior plan. Because what I've seen for the last 10, 15 years, I'd see kids in middle school, and all of a sudden I see like what happened in elementary school. You can see it's evident that basically the kids just fell through the crack in elementary school. There was no plan put in place for the students, and it just went through and coming in middle school. So I think to tackle these problems, I think that the root cause we have to deal with in the elementary school.
Thank you, Representative Baez. Representative Giraldo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Parisi, can you talk about your response to this snippet from a Harvard study? Harvard School of Education did a study on how school discipline is linked to later consequences. Specifically, students assigned to a school with one standard deviation higher suspension rates are 15 to 20% more likely to be arrested and incarcerated as adults, and were also less likely to attend a four-year college. Male minority students were most likely to be affected negatively by stricter school policy. Can you talk about how the sort of pushback that and opposition to suspension rates matches with the study that I think many of us who have worked in education would also second and would also understand that early suspensions have later consequences in life?
Sure. First of all, I'm not aware of the specific study you've cited. It's certainly something I'll take a look at. Perhaps we can engage in a conversation later. But let me offer this much, because we've been dealing with a lot of discipline-related legislation in the Assembly over the years, and I'm not, I'm not looking to promote the use of suspension, but I am cautioning all of you that you don't want a blanket prohibition either, because the learning environment for the whole school classroom is at stake when schools aren't able to effectively deal with disruptive influences. And I'm not saying suspension's the best way. I agree it ought to be a last resort, and I think I can agree that we ought to find ways to intervene as soon as possible on these students. But on that report specifically, one thing I don't know the answer to is whether or not the suspensions tied to future entanglement in the legal system or whatever is caused by suspensions, or there's just a correlation. Because my guess is it's not the act of suspension itself that is the real problem, but there are some core issues that students have that schools in the community aren't effectively dealing with. And I would agree we have to figure out ways to deal with it. I just fear a blanket prohibition on suspension, because I fear that school classrooms will be less conducive to learning, not more conducive to learning, especially in this age of heightened accountability systems that we have in Rhode Island and throughout the country.
Thank you for that. And I also agree that the later effects in life are really rooted in core issues that I think this bill aims to address, rather than sort of jump the gun, have a suspension, and not address sort of the core issues that many of our students are facing. And so I agree with you on that, but I think that this is what this bill is aiming to do, to have a conversation about what it is that's affecting the students before it ends up impacting them later on in life. And I think another option that could be explored to letting a class cool down after a very tense incident is suspensions that are within the school. So, in-school suspension or replacement or removal from a specific classroom and being placed into another classroom, so that there's no learning loss, which is also detrimental to an elementary school student. So I am fully in support of this bill. I think it's a great way to start addressing the issues that we have, and especially with our elementary schools. And I thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for your comments, Mr. Parisi.
Thank you, Representative Giraldo. Next, someone that has spent much more time in elementary school than any of us, professional health educator and administrator, Representative Donovan of Bristol. Welcome, Representative.
Thank you. I hope you all can.
Yeah, we can hear you, but you just froze. I don't know what happened.
This bill,
There you go.
anything, this needs a long conversation. Oh, I'm not there anymore? Am I back?
Yeah, you're on. Yeah, proceed. Yep. Well, that's what we're having. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm having Wi-Fi problems. I'm really sorry. If you can't hear me, I'll write it in another time, but this really needs a lot of attention. Am I being heard now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I retired a few years ago, and I can tell you when I was there, we had kids that would very young, 5 and 6 years old, who would do things that were suspendable. And they were really acting out for some significant abuse that was happening at home. So that's one case. And the other thing it needs is, presently, I have grandchildren in elementary school, and the behavior that's being exhibited is taking away from their education. When they're little, you don't want to suspend them all the time. I mean, they need to be in school. But when these things are happening, they're usually indicative of something bigger happening at home, or somewhere else. So we've got to have some mechanism that does it faster. Sometimes it's just things. When we want to pay attention to it, the bureaucracy around the issues, it takes too long. So I'm really glad you brought this up, and perhaps we can have more conversation with the other stakeholders and the other people on this call who have called in to express themselves. But I just wanted to thank you for bringing it up, because I can't tell you how often I've been in these conversations in my career and then after my career. So thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Donovan, and we greatly appreciate your expertise with this, particularly this issue. With that, any questions for Representative Donovan? Thank you very much. And Randall Rose, welcome and please proceed. Welcome, Mr. Rose. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I am speaking against the bill, and I recognize it has a number of good things in it, but I also have concerns, so I'm opposed to the bill in its present form. One concern I have, and let me just ask you about this, at the bottom of page 1, it says that before suspending a K through 5 student, you have to go through the provisions of subsection C, which is the appeal to the Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education. That seems to mean that there has to be an appeal to the Commissioner whether the student and parents want it or not before the suspension happens, and a hearing before the Commissioner. At least that's how what it means if I read it literally, but am I misreading this?
What do you think? I don't think so.
I'm not sure what the bottom sentence on page 1 means. It says the provisions of subsection C shall be implemented prior to suspending a K through 5 student. Why is there that sentence just for K through 5 students when all students have the right to appeal?
Yeah. Yes, Randall, we'll look at that. You might be onto something. Unfortunately, in the copy that I have, the bottom line is excluded on the copy. But please proceed. Yep.
Okay. Yes. Well, maybe you're in a position to do something about the legal size paper issue, and that would solve problems for a lot of us. But yes. In any case, you're not the only one who has the bottom lines excluded when you try to print on ordinary size paper. In any case, I do have a number of concerns about this. First of all, there's a long-standing problem of racial disparities in suspensions. It's received attention from the General Assembly in years past, and the problem is still persisting, and it seems that schools have not figured out how to solve that problem. And this bill doesn't seem to address that very much. The only line that's at all relevant to that is that the behavior plan has to be culturally responsive to the student, but it's culturally responsive as judged by the school district. And school districts themselves, we know, have not been very successful in reducing racial disparities in suspensions. So I'm not necessarily, because they haven't been very successful in reducing racial disparities, I'm not going to assume that the plan is culturally responsive simply because the school district says so. Because if they knew how to be culturally responsive, we would not have these racial disparities in such a scale. So
Okay.
I would like to see more in the bill to address the problem of racial disparities in suspensions. I also have one other concern, which is that it says the behavior plan shall be signed by the student's parent or guardian, as well as by the student. We're talking about K through 5 students, and of course, there are many kindergartners who simply do not have the ability to sign their name, and even for those who do write their name, if this is the first time they're signing their name to an agreement, I don't think it's necessarily going to mean to them what we expect it to mean. So it seems a little odd to be asking kindergartners to sign their name to an agreement with a school district, and I don't think they have. I don't think they're close enough to adult competence to necessarily be able to take a signed agreement seriously the way we're used to. We may just be sending a message to them that signing agreements is something imposed and not representing your own will. And finally, I have concerns about the assumption in the bill that the increasingly stronger disciplinary steps is the way to solve the problem. It often is, but not always. We've already heard earlier today that some of these kids who are acting out are doing that in response to things they're experiencing at home. If the bill kind of tells school districts that the response to these problems has to be increasingly stronger steps, that's not going to be the best approach in all cases. In many cases it will be, but in some cases you do need to find a more understanding approach that may not involve upping the penalty each time. I do worry that there's a risk that very young kids may end up being pushed into even more of an adversarial relation with the school district or with people in charge as a result of this being implemented in too much of a one-size-fits-all way, and that can have bad consequences if it doesn't get at the heart of the problem. So I don't think this bill as currently written is the best way to deal with the problem, even though there are many good provisions in this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. Any questions for Mr. Rose? Thank you very much. Hannah Stern. Welcome, Ms. Stern.
Hi, thank you, Chairman and members of the committee, for your time this afternoon. My name is Hannah Stern on behalf of the ACLU of Rhode Island. We are supportive of the goal contained within this bill, and we're in agreement with Chairman McNamara that the rates of K-5 suspensions in Rhode Island are really quite horrifying and very deserving of legislative action. Our concern, though, is that while this bill would require a disciplinary plan before the issuance of an out-of-school suspension, it doesn't otherwise restrict in any way the types of offenses that can be actually subject to disciplinary action, and also it still leaves suspension as a lingering option for all offenses. So one of the school disciplinary issues that we track is the prevalence of suspensions for K-5 students for more subjective and vague offenses like insubordination or disrespect. And it's the position of our organization that these types of offenses really shouldn't be subject to punitive action like discipline, like escalating disciplinary tactics or suspensions at all. So we hope that this bill indicates a trend towards an overall overhaul of disciplinary policy in Rhode Island, and we really, really appreciate the attention being paid to such an important issue. But we would further encourage the explicit limitation of the ability for K-5 students to receive a suspension really at all. So thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions.
And thank you for your work, Hannah, especially with student suspensions over the years. We greatly appreciate it. And if you have any specific suggestions, please pass them along. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Are there any questions for Ms. Stern? Thank you very much. Paige, Claudius. Paige, Claudius Potts. Welcome, Paige.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Paige Closhus-Parks. I'm a senior policy analyst with Rhode Island Kids Count. Rhode Island Kids Count would like to voice its support for House Bill 5078, and we would also like to encourage the committee to also consider future legislation that would prohibit the use of suspensions at the elementary school level. Effective school disciplinary practices promote a safe and respectful school climate, supporting learning, and address the cause of student misbehavior. Suspensions usually do not deter students from exhibiting negative behaviors and may actually reinforce negative behavior patterns. Representative Giraldo also mentioned the research. The research shows that suspended students are more likely than their peers to experience academic failure, juvenile justice system involvement, and disengagement from school, isolation from teachers and peers, and dropping out of school. Over the past several years, the General Assembly has passed a number of bills aimed at reducing suspensions, particularly out-of-school suspensions. We're also encouraged by the efforts of individual school districts to reduce the use of out-of-school suspensions and encourage the use of alternative disciplinary approaches, such as restorative justice and the positive behavior interventions and support, also known as PBIS. And we also commend Rhode, who offers quite a few resources on their website, including data tools, recommendations regarding alternatives to suspensions, and guidance on how to address disciplinary issues. However, despite all of these efforts, the number of out-of-school suspensions has decreased by less than 1% since the passage of the General Assembly legislation in 2016. My written testimony includes a chart that shows the bias that we've seen in school discipline by special education status and race ethnicity. So during the 2018-19 school year, students with disabilities were disproportionately suspended. So students with disabilities in that school year were 15% of the student population, but they represented 31% of all suspensions. For Black students, they represented 9% of the population, but represented 12% of suspensions. And for Hispanic students, who were 26% of the student population, but represented 34% of suspensions. And then if we also look at our elementary school students in this same school year, 15% of all suspensions, which was just over 1,500, involved our elementary school students. And 74% of those suspensions were out-of-school suspensions. Kindergartners also received 133 disciplinary actions, and 110 of those were out-of-school suspensions. So Rhode Island Kids Count, we support efforts that improve school climate. We also thank you, Chairman, for your leadership around introducing legislation that supports positive school climate, including your bills introduced last week. We also support efforts to increase investment so that school mental health professionals are available for students and staff. And thank you so much for your leadership over these past years to support students in schools. Before I conclude my testimony, I know there was a little bit of issue with me also getting in to express our support for Bill 5157 regarding annual reports for the academic achievement of students in foster care. So we also support that bill. And that concludes my testimony. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Paige. We miss you. We hope to see you in person very soon. Are there any...
The feelings are mutual. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Paige? Thank you very much. Mr. Tim Ryan, Rhode Island Association of School Superintendents. Mr. Ryan, welcome. Welcome. Please proceed. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Chairman McNamara. For Bill 5078, the Superintendent's Association certainly is very cautious about any suspensions of elementary school students, and I think we support the intent of this. I do think that it's a little bit constrictive. Having served in just about every capacity from high school to elementary in my public education career, there are circumstances where maybe an act of violence, maybe an extreme meltdown at school necessitates a school principal to call the parent. There may be circumstances that the school just can't deal with, emergency circumstances. So I think the provision in this, there should be some language, and I'd be happy to submit something on that that would provide for emergency situations, for perhaps a child who has not exhibited any issues before, that there isn't a behavior plan. They might just have just a really traumatic event, and it necessitates bringing a parent in to deal with the situation. So that would be my only concern with 5078.
Okay,
I'm sorry, sir.
No, keep going.
And I just wanted, I made a mistake. I did want to be in support of your first bill, 5069. I do support that legislation.
Okay, and if you could just stay on the line for a minute,
Sure.
Mr. Ryan. Are there any questions for Mr. Ryan? That concludes House Bill 5078.